The sun was setting over the flat expanse of Oklahoma, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A black truck driver sat behind the wheel of his massive semi-truck, humming along to an old blues song playing softly on the radio. He'd been driving for hours, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic click-clack of the tires against asphalt lulling him into a familiar kind of calm. This road wasn't new to him. He'd traveled it countless times before, but today felt different. Somehow. Maybe it was the weather. The horizon ahead looked ominous. Dark clouds loomed low, swirling like they were alive. The air outside had that strange stillness you only notice just before a storm hits. His CB radio crackled to life with warnings from other drivers up ahead. "Tornado watch in effect," one voice said. "Folks, find shelter if you can." He glanced at the dashboard clock. He was already running late with this delivery. Hospitals in Tulsa were waiting on the medical supplies stacked carefully in the trailer behind him. Every minute counted. Pulling over to wait out the storm would mean penalties he couldn't afford, not to mention letting down people who depended on those supplies. Still, he hesitated. Tornadoes weren't something you took lightly. For a moment, he thought about calling it quits, finding a safe spot to hunker down until the worst passed. But then he remembered the last time he'd let fear dictate his choices. Back when he was younger, he'd turned down a job because the route seemed too risky. That decision haunted him, not because of the money he lost, but because he realized later that someone else had stepped up and done what he hadn't. They'd faced the challenge head-on while he stayed safe in the shadows. "No," he muttered, to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Not this time. With a deep breath, he pressed the accelerator, feeling the rumble of the engine beneath him as the truck surged forward. The road stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the fields around him for a brief second before plunging everything back into shadow. The wind picked up, whipping through the tall grass like invisible hands trying to pull him off course. As he drove, memories flooded his mind. Stories his grandmother used to tell him about storms like these. She grew up in Mississippi, where tornadoes were as common as rain showers. "You respect the storm," she'd say, her voice steady but firm. "But you don't let it stop you from doing what needs to be done." Her words echoed in his ears, now grounding him even as the world outside grew more chaotic. Up ahead, the highway narrowed, flanked by rows of trees bending under the force of the gale. The first drops of rain hit the windshield, fat and heavy, smearing across the glass before the wipers could clear them away. It started slowly, almost teasingly, but within minutes, the downpour became relentless. Visibility dropped sharply, forcing him to slow down. His knuckles whitened on the wheel as he leaned forward, squinting through the deluge. Then came the sound, a low, eerie roar that grew louder by the second. It wasn't thunder. It was something else entirely, something primal. He knew that sound. Everyone who'd spent enough time in the Midwest did. A tornado was forming, and it was close. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. Panic wouldn't help anyone right now. As he rounded a bend in the road, he spotted headlights in the distance. Several cars were pulled over on the shoulder, their occupants likely seeking refuge from the storm. But as he got closer, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A group of people standing near an overturned vehicle, frantically waving their arms for help. Without thinking twice, he signaled and pulled his truck onto the shoulder. "Yo!" Wind screamed around him as he opened the door and stepped out, shielding his face from flying debris. "Get in!" he shouted, motioning toward the cab of his truck. The strangers didn't hesitate. One by one, they scrambled aboard, their faces pale with terror, their clothes soaked through. Among them was a young mother clutching her toddler tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. An older man with blood trickling from a cut on his forehead leaned heavily on the seat. And there was a woman dressed in business attire, her sharp suit looking oddly out of place amidst the chaos. She nodded at him briefly, her eyes filled with gratitude despite the fear etched on her face. Once everyone was inside, he climbed back into the driver's seat and revved the engine. The truck groaned as he maneuvered it away from the danger zone, the tornado's roar growing fainter with each passing mile. Inside the cab, no one spoke. All that could be heard was the sound of breathing, quick, shallow gasps as they processed what had just happened. "You saved us," the woman in the suit finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was strength in her words. "Thank you." He shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "Just doing what anyone else would have done," he replied. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have risked their own safety to help strangers in the middle of a disaster. For now, though, all that mattered was getting them somewhere. The storm outside was relentless, battering the truck like an angry beast determined to tear it apart. Inside the cab, the air felt thick with tension and exhaustion. The strangers he'd rescued were quiet now, each lost in their own thoughts, but the weight of what had just happened hung over them all. Every so often, the woman in the business suit would glance at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and curiosity. He could feel her eyes on him, studying him, but he didn't say anything. His focus was entirely on keeping the truck steady as the wind howled around them. The tornado wasn't far behind. Even through the rain-streaked windows, they could see flashes of debris flying past. Branches, pieces of metal, even parts of roofs torn from nearby homes. It was hard to believe they'd made it out alive. The young mother clutched her toddler tightly, rocking him gently as if trying to shield him from the chaos outside. The boy was wide-eyed, his little hands gripping her shirt, but he didn't cry. Maybe he didn't fully understand the danger they were in. Or maybe he sensed that his mom needed him to be brave. The older man with the cut on his forehead leaned back against the seat, wincing slightly. Blood still trickled down his face, though not as much as before. He looked pale, shaken, but he managed a weak smile when the truck driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You're good at this," the man said hoarsely, nodding toward the road ahead. "I don't think anyone else could have driven us through that mess." The comment caught the driver off guard. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not for something as ordinary as driving. To him, it was just part of the job. But tonight, under these impossible conditions, it felt different. This wasn't about hauling freight or meeting deadlines anymore. This was life or death, and somehow he'd become responsible for these people's survival. "Just keep your head down and drive straight," he replied gruffly, trying to brush off the praise. "That's all there is to it." But the truth was he wasn't as calm as he sounded. Beneath the surface, his mind raced with questions. What if he hadn't stopped? What if the tornado had caught up to them? These thoughts gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside. There was no room for doubt right now, not while everyone was counting on him. As the miles rolled by, the storm began to ease ever so slightly. The deafening roar of the tornado faded into the distance, replaced by the steady patter of rain against the windshield. The driver exhaled slowly, realizing only then how tense he'd been holding his body. His shoulders relaxed a fraction, and he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They weren't safe yet, but they were closer than they had been. To lighten the mood, he started talking, a habit he'd picked up over years of long, lonely drives. At first, it was small talk, nothing too serious. "So, where y'all headed?" he asked, glancing at the group in the rearview mirror. No one answered immediately, but after a pause, the older man spoke up. "I was going to visit my daughter in Tulsa," he said, his voice still rough but steadier now. "She just had a baby last week. First grandkid." He smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Guess I'll have to call her and let her know I'm running late." The young mother perked up at this, her grip on her son loosening just a bit. "How old is she?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. 3 days, the man replied, pride creeping into his tone despite everything. "Little girl. Named her Lily." The conversation seemed to break some kind of spell. Slowly, the others joined in, sharing bits and pieces of their stories. The woman in the suit explained she'd been traveling for work, visiting towns across Oklahoma to meet with local leaders. She didn't go into detail about what exactly she did, just that it involved helping communities prepare for emergencies. Funny how things work out, she murmured almost to herself. Never thought I'd end up needing rescuing instead of doing the rescuing. The driver chuckled at that, shaking his head. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. By the time they reached a safer stretch of highway, the atmosphere in the cab had shifted. The fear was still there, lingering in the background, but it was tempered by something else. Connection. These strangers, thrown together by chance, had formed a fragile bond. They weren't just survivors, they were witnesses to each other's humanity. The gas station parking lot was a scene of organized chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the edges, their red and blue lights casting an eerie glow over the wet asphalt. People moved in every direction, some crying, others shouting instructions, a few just standing there, staring blankly at the destruction around them. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered like a heavy fog, pressing down on everyone who'd survived it. Inside the truck cab, the group hesitated for a moment, before stepping out into the cold night air. The driver grabbed his phone from the dashboard, checking for service. No signal yet. He sighed and shoved it back into his pocket. There wasn't much he could do about that right now. Instead, he climbed out of the truck and stretched his stiff legs, feeling the sharp bite of the wind against his skin. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the ground was slick with mud, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. As he walked around to check on the passengers, he noticed the woman in the business suit talking quietly with one of the paramedics. She gestured toward the overturned car they'd escaped earlier, her hands moving quickly as she explained what had happened. The paramedic nodded, jotting notes onto a clipboard before hurrying off to join his team. When she turned back toward the group, her face was calm but focused, like someone used to taking charge in tough situations. "You okay?" the driver asked when she approached him. His tone was casual, almost nonchalant, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "I'm fine," she replied, brushing a strand of damp hair away from her face. "Just making sure they know where to look for anyone else who might be trapped." She paused, glancing at the crowd of survivors huddled under makeshift tarps nearby. "What about you? You must be exhausted." He shrugged, leaning against the side of the truck. "I've been through worse," he said simply, though the truth was, he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this drained. Physically, mentally, it all weighed on him. But he wasn't about to admit that. Not here, not now. These people needed strength, not vulnerability. The young mother emerged from the cab next, her toddler balanced awkwardly on her hip. The boy clung to her neck, his tiny face pale but alert. She looked overwhelmed, her clothes still soaked and her shoes caked with mud. Seeing her struggle, the older man stepped forward to help. "Here, let me take him for a bit," he offered gently, holding out his arms. After a brief hesitation, she handed the child over, relief washing over her features. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I would have done if—" Her words trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. The driver watched the exchange silently, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness exactly, nor pride. Maybe it was just humanity. In moments like this, stripped bare of everything except survival, people showed their true colors. And tonight, he'd seen more courage and kindness than he ever expected. Sudden commotion drew their attention. A group of volunteers had arrived with blankets, bottled water, and snacks. Word spread quickly among the survivors, and soon a line formed as people shuffled forward to receive whatever aid they could. The driver waved off the first volunteer who approached him, insisting he didn't need anything. "Save it for the ones who really need it," he muttered, nodding toward the families huddled together nearby. But the woman in the suit intervened, pulling him aside. "You're not invincible, you know," she said firmly, pressing a blanket into his hands. "Take care of yourself too, we still need you." Her words struck a chord, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she said it, with authority, yes, but also with genuine care. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders without argument, feeling its warmth seep into his chilled bones. For the first time since the storm hit, he allowed himself to sit down, leaning back against the truck's tire as he surveyed the scene around him. The young mother sat cross-legged on the ground a few feet away, cradling a cup of hot coffee someone had given her. Her son played quietly in the dirt beside her, using a stick to draw shapes no one else could see. The older man stood nearby, chatting with another survivor about their shared hometown. Their laughter carried faintly over the hum of activity, a small reminder that life went on, even after something so devastating. Meanwhile, the woman in the suit continued to move among the crowd, offering comfort and direction wherever she could. She seemed to have a knack for knowing exactly what people needed. A kind word here, a practical suggestion there. Watching her, the driver realized she wasn't just some random traveler caught in the storm. There was purpose in the way she carried herself, a sense of responsibility that went beyond mere coincidence. When she finally returned to him, her expression was softer, more reflective. "You're remarkable, you know that?" she said quietly, sitting down beside him. "Not many people would have stopped like you did." He snorted, shaking his head. "I didn't do anything special, just drove a truck." "That's not true," she countered, her voice firm. "You risked your life to save strangers, that's extraordinary." For once, he didn't argue. Maybe she was right, or maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were all still breathing, still standing, despite everything the storm had thrown at them. As the hours ticked by, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving behind a deep exhaustion that settled into their bones. The sky lightened ever so slightly, hinting at dawn's approach. Survivors started drifting off to sleep wherever they could find space, a bench, the hood of a car, even the muddy ground. The driver leaned his head back against the truck, closing his eyes for just a moment. Beside him, the woman in the suit did the same, her breathing slow and steady. In that quiet lull, surrounded by devastation but alive nonetheless, he felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had taken so much, but it hadn't taken everything. Not yet. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a pale golden glow over the battered landscape, the reality of the storm's destruction became painfully clear. Trees lay uprooted, their massive trunks snapped like twigs. Power lines sagged dangerously close to the ground, sparking intermittently. Homes were reduced to piles of splintered wood and twisted metal, their contents scattered across fields as far as the eye could see. The once familiar highway now looked like a war zone, littered with debris that told stories of lives interrupted. The driver stood by his truck, staring at the wreckage in silence. His body ached from hours of tension, but it was the weight of what he'd witnessed that truly wore him down. He'd seen storms before. Growing up in the Midwest, they were practically a fact of life. But nothing quite like this. This wasn't just a storm. It was an act of nature so violent it left scars not just on the land but on the people who lived there. Nearby, emergency workers continued their grim task of searching for survivors, or worse, remains. Volunteers moved among the displaced, handing out food, water, and blankets. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed and silent, while others wandered aimlessly, dazed and disoriented. The air buzzed with the low murmur of voices, punctuated occasionally by sobs or shouts. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, driven by the sheer will of those determined to help. The woman in the business suit approached him again, her face drawn but resolute. She carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, offering one to him wordlessly. He accepted it gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warmth as if trying to soak up some semblance of normalcy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood side by side, watching the world slowly come back to life. "You've done more than you realize," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying a note of conviction that made him glance at her. "People like you don't get enough credit. You're out here every day, keeping things running even when no one notices." And then something like, "This happens, and you step up without hesitation." He shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. Praise had always made him uneasy, especially when it came from someone who seemed so put together. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, looking away. "Anyone else would have done the same." She shook her head firmly. No, they wouldn't. Trust me, I know. Most people freeze in situations like this, but you acted. You didn't think twice about risking your own safety to save strangers. She paused, studying him closely. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He didn't respond immediately, unsure of what to say. Instead, he took a sip of the coffee, letting its bitterness anchor him. Deep down, he knew she was right. Not everyone would have stopped. Hell, most drivers probably would have kept going, too focused on their deliveries or too afraid to risk getting caught in the storm themselves. But admitting that felt strange, almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to thinking of himself as brave. To him, bravery was something other people did. Firefighters rushing into burning buildings, soldiers charging into battle. Not a truck driver making a split-second decision on a lonely stretch of highway. The young mother appeared a short distance away, her son perched on her hip as she talked to a volunteer. She looked exhausted but calmer now, her shoulders less tense than they had been hours earlier. Spotting the driver, she gave him a small wave and began walking toward. By the time the reporter packed up her gear and moved on to interview other survivors, the driver still hadn't fully processed what had just happened. He stood there, staring at the card in his hand like it might disappear if he blinked too hard. It was simple enough. White with black lettering embossed with the official seal of the United States Senate. But its weight felt heavier than anything he'd ever held before. The woman who'd given it to him watched his reaction closely, her lips curving into a small smile. You deserve recognition, she said softly, as though reading his thoughts. What you did last night wasn't ordinary. People need to hear stories like yours. He shook his head, trying to shrug off the compliment. I didn't do nothing special, he muttered, shoving the card into his pocket. Just drove my truck. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his modesty. You risked your life for complete strangers. That's not nothing, and it's definitely not ordinary. Her tone softened. Trust me, I know how rare that kind of selflessness is. And when I get back to Washington, I want to make sure people understand why moments like this matter. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He didn't respond right away, unsure of what to say. Recognition wasn't something he sought out or even wanted. He'd spent most of his life flying under the radar, content to live quietly and do his job without drawing attention to himself. But now, standing here in the shadow of destruction, with cameras rolling and reporters scribbling notes, he couldn't ignore the fact that his actions had touched more lives than just those he'd pulled from the storm. As the day wore on, word of his heroism spread quickly among the survivors and volunteers. Strangers approached him to shake his hand, pat him on the back, or simply thank him again. Some shared their own stories, how they'd lost homes, cars, belongings, but all agreed that surviving the tornado had given them a second chance, and they credited him for being part of that miracle. For someone used to blending into the background, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. Every time someone called him a hero, he felt a mix of pride and discomfort. Pride because deep down, he knew he'd done the right thing. Discomfort because he didn't see himself as extraordinary. To him, stopping had been instinctive, almost reflexive. If roles were reversed, wouldn't anyone else have done the same? Despite his reservations, the attention kept coming. News outlets picked up the story, turning it into a beacon of hope amid the tragedy. Social media buzzed with posts praising the unnamed truck driver who'd braved the storm to save lives. Even local radio stations played clips of his brief interview, highlighting his humility and courage. The phrase "just drove my truck" became a rallying cry of sorts, symbolizing quiet strength in the face of chaos. Back at the gas station, the group he'd rescued stuck together like glue. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were family, bound by shared trauma and gratitude. The young mother hugged her son tightly, whispering prayers of thanks every time she looked at the driver. The older man joked about starting a fan club, earning chuckles from the others despite the grim circumstances. And the woman in the suit? She stayed close, occasionally pulling him aside to answer questions from journalists or fill in details. About the rescue. One reporter asked him directly, "Why did you stop? Weren't you scared?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Of course I was scared," he admitted finally, his voice low but steady. "But fear doesn't mean you run away. Sometimes it means you step up. Those folks out there, they needed help. What else was I supposed to do?" His answer resonated deeply, capturing the essence of what made his actions so remarkable. It wasn't about grand gestures or calculated risks. It was about doing what felt right, even when everything else screamed to turn back. In a world often consumed by selfishness and division, his choice stood out like a lighthouse in a storm, a reminder that humanity could still shine through even in the darkest moments. As evening approached, the authorities announced plans to transport survivors to nearby shelters. Buses lined up along the highway, ready to ferry people to safety. The driver helped load supplies onto one of the vehicles, his movements slow but deliberate. His body ached from lack of sleep, but his mind raced with questions. Should he stay and help with cleanup efforts, or should he focus on delivering the medical supplies still sitting in his trailer? Before he could decide, the woman in the suit appeared beside him, her expression thoughtful. "Listen," she began, her tone serious. "I'm heading back to DC tomorrow. There's a hearing next week about disaster preparedness, and I want you to testify." His eyes widened in disbelief. "Testify? Me? You're joking, right?" "I've never been more serious," she replied firmly. "Your story matters. Lawmakers need to hear firsthand accounts of what it's like out here during these disasters. Who better to tell them than someone who lived it and saved lives doing it?" He laughed nervously, shaking his head. "I'm just a truck driver. I don't know the first thing about talking to Congress." "That's exactly why you're perfect," she countered. "You represent millions of people who work tirelessly behind the scenes, keeping this country running. Your voice will remind them of the real human impact of their decisions." Her conviction was contagious, and though the idea terrified him, he found himself nodding slowly. Maybe she was right. Maybe sharing his experience could make a difference, not just for him, but for everyone else living paycheck to paycheck, mile by mile, hoping for a little support when disaster strikes. By the time the buses pulled away, carrying survivors to safer ground, the driver felt a strange sense of purpose settling over him. For years, he'd measured success in deliveries completed and deadlines met. Now, standing amidst the ruins of a town ravaged by nature's fury, he realized there was more to life than schedules and spreadsheets. Sometimes the most important things couldn't be measured at all. As he climbed back into his truck and started the engine, the woman in the suit waved goodbye, mouthing words he'd remember forever. "See you soon." The drive to Tulsa felt longer than usual, though the roads had mostly cleared by the time he got moving again. The medical supplies in his trailer weighed heavily on his mind, not just because of their importance, but because they symbolized something bigger now. Delivering them wasn't just about meeting a deadline or earning a paycheck. It was about fulfilling a promise to people who needed help, even if they'd never know his name. That thought stayed with him as the miles rolled by, the rhythmic hum of the tires against asphalt blending with the whirlwind of emotions inside him. When he finally arrived at the hospital, the staff greeted him like a long-lost friend. They were exhausted, their scrubs wrinkled and their eyes shadowed from days of non-stop work. But they lit up when they saw his truck pull into the loading dock. "You have no idea how much this means," one nurse said, her voice cracking slightly as she helped unload boxes of bandages, medications, and IV bags. "We've been rationing supplies for days. This is a lifeline." He nodded, brushing off their thanks with a gruff smile. "Just doing my job," he muttered, though the words felt hollow now. After everything that had happened, he knew it wasn't just a job anymore. It was responsibility. It was humanity. And maybe, just maybe, it was destiny. By the time the last box was unloaded, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the parking lot in shades of deep orange and purple. He sat in the cab of his truck for a while, staring out at the quiet cityscape. Tulsa seemed worlds away from the devastation he'd left behind, Yet he couldn't shake the images of twisted metal and broken homes from his mind. The contrast between here and there, the safety versus the chaos, was stark, almost jarring. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from the woman in the suit. "Hope you made it to Tulsa safely. Let me know when you're ready to talk about DC." Her message was short but carried an unmistakable tone of urgency. She believed in him, even if he didn't fully believe in himself yet. For the next few days, life returned to some semblance of normalcy, or at least what passed for normal in his line of work. He hauled another load to Kansas City, then swung back south toward Texas. The open road was familiar, comforting in its predictability, but his mind kept drifting back to the storm, the survivors, and the invitation to testify before Congress. Every mile marker felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something he couldn't ignore. Finally, after delivering a shipment in Dallas, he decided it was time to call her. His fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before he dialed, the sound of ringing filling the silence of the truck cab. When she answered, her voice was warm but professional. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you," she said with a hint of amusement. "What's on your mind?" "I'll do it," he replied simply, skipping any preamble. "If you think it'll help, I'll testify." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a soft laugh. "Good. I already started making arrangements. You'll fly out tomorrow morning. Don't worry. I'll walk you through everything." Her confidence calmed his nerves, but the reality of what lay ahead still loomed large. Testifying before Congress? Him, a guy who spent most of his life steering 18 wheels across highways and avoiding small talk. It sounded absurd, like something out of a movie, but then again, so did stopping to rescue strangers. Back in his truck, heading toward his next destination, he realized something important. Life wasn't just about surviving the storms. It was about finding meaning in the aftermath. And sometimes, all it took was one act of courage to change, not only your own life, but the lives of countless others. The flight home was quiet, the kind of silence that lets your thoughts run wild. He stared out the window at the patchwork of fields and highways below, replaying the events of the past. Few days in his mind, the hearing had gone better than he'd ever imagined, better than he'd even hoped. Lawmakers had listened intently, nodding along as he spoke, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. Reporters had swarmed him afterward, peppering him with questions about his experience and what he thought needed to change. For someone who usually avoided attention, it was overwhelming, but also empowering. By the time the plane touched down, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Exhaustion because he hadn't slept much since leaving DC, and exhilaration because he knew something inside him had shifted. Testifying before Congress wasn't just a box he'd checked off his list, it was a turning point. It made him realize that his voice mattered, that the stories of people like him working behind the scenes deserved to be heard. When he climbed back into his truck at the airport parking lot, the familiar scent of leather and diesel greeted him like an old friend. This was his world, the open road, the endless miles, the freedom to move wherever the job took him. But now that world felt bigger somehow, broader, like there were possibilities stretching beyond the horizon that he'd never considered before. As he drove through the night, heading toward his next delivery, his phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Social media had exploded after his testimony. Strangers sent messages thanking him for speaking up, sharing their own struggles as truck drivers or emergency responders. Some praised his bravery during the storm, while others expressed frustration with the lack of support for workers like him. Each message added fuel to the fire burning inside him, a growing determination to do more. By morning, he'd reached a small diner off the interstate for breakfast. The waitress recognized him immediately, her eyes lighting up as she approached his booth. "Aren't you the guy from the news?" she asked, setting down a menu. "The one who saved those folks in the tornado?" He chuckled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess that's me." "Well, your meal's on the house," she declared, beaming. "We don't get many heroes around here." Her words made him uncomfortable, but not in a bad way. It wasn't about being called a hero. It was about seeing how his actions had rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the people he'd pulled from the wreckage. That realization stuck with him long after he left the diner, the taste of pancakes and coffee lingering alongside the warmth of human connection. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a rhythm again, or at least as close to a rhythm as a trucker's life allowed. Deliveries came and went, highways stretched endlessly ahead, and the sun rose and set in its usual cycle. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed something to the universe, or maybe just to himself, for everything that had happened, the storm, the rescue, the hearing, they weren't accidents. They were signs pointing him toward something greater. One evening, parked at a rest stop near Amarillo, he found himself scrolling through social media again. A post caught his eye. A fundraiser organized by a group of truck drivers raising money for disaster relief. The caption read, "Inspired by the man who reminded us we're stronger together." Attached was a photo of him standing outside the Capitol building, looking slightly out of place but determined. That's when it hit him. If his story could inspire others, why shouldn't he take it further? Why not turn this moment of recognition into something lasting, something that could help not just survivors of disasters but the everyday workers who kept the country running? The idea started small, almost too simple to seem real. What if he created a network of truck drivers trained to respond in emergencies? People who already traveled the highways could serve as first responders, carrying supplies and offering aid when disasters struck. It wouldn't cost much to start, just some basic training and coordination, but the impact could be huge. Excited by the thought, he reached out to the woman in the suit. She answered almost immediately, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "I love it," she said without hesitation. "Let's make it happen." With her guidance, he began reaching out to fellow truckers, sharing his vision and asking for input. To his surprise, they responded eagerly. Many had been through similar situations, helping stranded motorists, delivering critical supplies during hurricanes or wildfires, and they understood the need for better preparation. Within weeks, the idea grew legs, evolving into something tangible. A non-profit organization dedicated to equipping truckers with emergency response skills and resources. They called it Wheels of Hope. The name came to him late one night as he scribbled notes under the dim light of his dashboard. It fit perfectly, simple, hopeful, grounded in action. With donations pouring in from across the country and volunteers signing up daily, the project gained momentum faster than he'd dreamed possible. But it wasn't just about logistics or fundraising. It was about community. Every trucker who joined brought their own story, their own reasons for wanting to help. Some had lost loved ones in storms and wanted to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Others simply believed in the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Together they formed a patchwork quilt of resilience, stitched together by shared purpose. The woman in the suit stayed involved every step of the way, using her platform to amplify their mission. She arranged meetings with policymakers, secured grants, and helped spread the word through interviews and social media. "You're changing the game," she told him during one call. "This isn't just about truckers anymore. It's about redefining what it means to be prepared." As months turned into a year, Wheels of Hope became a household name, at least among those who lived and worked on the road. Training sessions popped up at truck stops nationwide, teaching drivers everything from basic first aid to navigating dangerous weather conditions. Trucks began carrying emergency kits stocked with food, water, blankets, and tools. And slowly but surely, the culture of the industry shifted. Drivers weren't just haulers anymore. They were lifelines, ready to step up when no one else could. Ray. Flight home was quiet, the kind of silence that lets your thoughts run wild. He stared out the window at the patchwork of fields and highways below, replaying the events of the past few days in his mind. The hearing had gone better than he'd ever imagined, better than he'd even hoped. Lawmakers had listened intently, nodding along as he spoke, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. Reporters had swarmed him afterward, peppering him with questions about his experience and what he thought needed to change. For someone who usually avoided attention, it was overwhelming, but also empowering. By the time the plane touched down, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Exhaustion because he hadn't slept much since leaving D.C., and exhilaration because he knew something inside him had shifted. Testifying before Congress wasn't just a box he'd checked off his list, it was a turning point. It made him realize that his voice mattered, that the stories of people like him working behind the scenes deserved to be heard. When he climbed back into his truck at the airport parking lot, the familiar scent of leather and diesel greeted him like an old friend. This was his world, the open road, the endless miles, the freedom to move wherever the job took him. But now that world felt bigger somehow, broader, like there were possibilities stretching beyond the horizon that he'd never considered before. As he drove through the night, heading toward his next delivery, his phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Social media had exploded after his testimony. Strangers sent messages thanking him for speaking up, sharing their own struggles as truck drivers or emergency responders. Some praised his bravery during the storm, while others expressed frustration with the lack of support for workers like him. Each message added fuel to the fire burning inside him, a growing determination to do more. By morning, he'd reached a small diner off the interstate for breakfast. The waitress recognized him immediately, her eyes lighting up as she approached his booth. "Aren't you the guy from the news?" she asked, setting down a menu. "The one who saved those folks in the tornado?" He chuckled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess that's me." "Well, your meal's on the house," she declared, beaming. "We don't get many heroes around here." Her words made him uncomfortable, but not in a bad way. It wasn't about being called a hero. It was about seeing how his actions had rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the people he'd pulled from the wreckage. That realization stuck with him long after he left the diner, the taste of pancakes and coffee lingering alongside the warmth of human connection. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a rhythm again, or at least as close to a rhythm as a trucker's life allowed. Deliveries came and went, highways stretched endlessly ahead, and the sun rose and set in its usual cycle. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed something to the universe. Or maybe just to. Years passed, and the story of the black truck driver who braved a tornado to save strangers became more than just a memory. It became a legend. Schools started teaching it in classrooms, using it as an example of how one person's actions could ripple outward and change lives. Teachers would stand at the front of the room holding up pictures of his semi-truck and recounting the events of that stormy night. "What would you have done?" they'd ask their students, sparking lively debates about bravery, responsibility, and humanity. The man himself never quite got used to being called a hero. To him, he was still just a guy doing his job, hauling freight, keeping schedules, living mile by mile on the open road. But every time someone stopped him at a gas station or sent him a letter thanking him for inspiring them, he felt a swell of gratitude. Not because he thought he deserved it, but because it reminded him of the goodness people were capable of when they came together. Wheels of Hope continued to grow, expanding beyond truckers to include other industries. Farmers, delivery drivers, even long-haul pilots joined the movement, eager to contribute their skills during emergencies. The nonprofit evolved into something bigger than anyone had imagined, a nationwide network of everyday heroes ready to step up when disaster struck. Training sessions turned into community gatherings where people shared meals, stories, and laughter alongside lessons in emergency preparedness. It wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about building connections, fostering trust, and reminding everyone that no one was ever truly alone. Every once in a while, the woman in the suit, now retired from politics but still deeply involved with the organization, would call him out of the blue. "How's life on the road?" she'd ask, her voice warm and familiar. They'd talk for hours, catching up on old times and brainstorming new ideas for the future. She always joked that he should write a book or start a podcast, but he'd laugh it off. "My story's already been told," he'd say. "It's time to let others take the wheel." And take the wheel they did. Across the country, drivers began sharing their own experiences, posting videos online, speaking at schools, and mentoring newcomers to the industry. One young woman, barely 20 years old, stood out among them. She'd grown up idolizing the man who'd saved lives during the tornado, and now she carried his message forward with fire and passion. "He showed us what's possible," she said during a speech at a national conference. "Now it's our turn to show the world." Statues of him atop his trusty rig began appearing in towns along his old routes, erected by grateful communities who wanted to honor his selflessness. Some were small and simple, while others were grand and detailed, complete with plaques describing his heroism. He avoided visiting them whenever possible. They made him feel awkward, like he didn't belong on a pedestal, but he appreciated the sentiment behind them. People weren't celebrating him, not really. They were celebrating the idea that ordinary folks could do extraordinary things. Back home in Memphis, he spent his downtime tinkering with his truck, keeping it running smoothly despite its age. It had become something of a symbol over the years, a rolling testament to resilience and determination. Strangers often asked to take photos with it, and he always obliged, happy to share a piece of his journey with whoever needed it. Sometimes, kids would climb into the cab, pretending to drive, and he'd chuckle, remembering how much he'd loved playing make-believe as a child. On weekends, he volunteered at local shelters, helping families displaced by storms or floods. The work was hard, but it grounded him, reminding him why he'd started Wheels of Hope in the first place. He wasn't just giving back. He was staying connected to the people whose lives had intersected with his. Their stories became part of his story, weaving a rich tapestry of shared struggles and triumphs. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his modest house, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, he reflected on everything that had happened. From the moment he decided to stop that stormy night to the creation of Wheels of Hope, his life had taken turns he never could have predicted. Fame hadn't changed him. He was still the same quiet, humble man who preferred the solitude of the road to the noise of crowds, but his perspective had shifted. He saw the world differently now, not as a series of highways and destinations, but as a web of interconnected lives, each thread vital to the whole. His phone buzzed on the table, beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from the young woman who'd spoken at the conference. "Just finished training 5 new recruits today. Thought you'd like to know." He smiled, typing a quick reply. "Proud of you. Keep pushing forward." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, he leaned back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of peace. Life hadn't been easy, and it probably wouldn't get any easier. Storms would come again, literal and metaphorical, testing the strength of those caught in their path. But he knew one thing for certain: humanity had a way of shining brightest in the darkest moments. And as long as there were people willing to step up, to lend a hand, to keep moving forward no matter what, the road ahead would always lead somewhere worth going. With a contented sigh, he rose from his chair, stretching his arms toward the heavens. Tomorrow was another day, another mile, another chance to make a difference, and he was ready.